Hello everybody, welcome to the Endgame course. I would like to help you understanding and enjoying the endgame part. We'll learn necessary concepts and ideas step by step. This series is about pawn endgames. Are you ready to learn? Let's go and let the orange juice work miracles. What you can learn from this video, you may ask. The first one would be the pawn race, the concept of the pawn promotion. Another one would be what is the pawn box and why we call it this way. And another one would be how to draw the pawn box, how to know if the pawn promotes or the king can capture the pawn, and why you need to know the pawn box concepts. Let's get started. First position, as you can see, there's the kings on the board and just one pawn. And now what's going on, how to figure out if we can catch the pawn. First of all, we need to see the position about the pawn. The pawn doesn't have any pawns in the line to the promotion. Second, we need to see that the king is not supporting the pawn because the king is too far away. And the third one, the general rule about the pawn box, it is the square of the pawn, but we call it this way because it is a way easier to remember. Therefore, we'll be referring to the pawn box. And how to draw the pawn box, you may ask. First, you just draw the diagonal from the pawn up to the line of the promotion. Then you can just put the line up to the king, then up to the pawn, and if you would like to, you can just make the square. Of course, this is not necessary, therefore, even though it's the square, but it looks like a triangle. This way, it will be even easier. And now, as you can see at this moment, the king is already in this triangle. If we can make these squares like that, or if we just even put the square, actually, this would be all of the squares, they are into the king is into the square, therefore the king can catch the pawn. And can catch the pawn, it means that can capture the pawn. Therefore, the king is inside the square of the pawn. Therefore, at this moment, as you can see, the pawn going to the promotion and the king is going to have the pawn captured in a few moves. And take notice that technically the pawn promotes to the queen, but the queen is not protected, therefore king captures. And in general, we can say that the king can catch the pawn or king can capture the pawn. It's up to you. The first position, now probably you understand it. Now let's get for the next one. At this moment, we can see that we need to draw the pawn box, and now we draw this way. This is a little bit easier than the box. Of course, you can just make the box if you wish this way, but we just not lose energy. And now what would be the idea to catch the pawn, to capture it if the pawn is running to the promotion? We need to get into one of these three squares. It doesn't matter which one, but we need to get into this one. And I'll just show you all of them one by one. First, if we get this way, we are just into this square, into the pawn box. Therefore, if the pawn gets to the promotion, we get up to the same square as well. And now the same idea applies all over again, up to the promotion square, and then we capture. Therefore, it's the first idea. If you just get into the other square, all of these squares are inside the pawn box, therefore all of them are good enough. Now the same idea. Take notice that at this moment, we can get again into one of these two squares up to the inside the square of the pawn, therefore it's up to you which one you choose. This way it doesn't matter. At some point it will matter. I will let you know where. And now the last one. If you get into this square belongs to the square of the pawn or the pawn box as well, therefore it's good enough as well. And you can see that we can even go this way, and up to this moment we are going here, the pawn promotes and we just capture. Therefore, as you can see, at this moment, we draw the diagonal up to the promotion line, then we put the line to the square the king can get into this one, and we can get into one of this, and this is the draw if black is on the move. Another position is the position that the king is a little bit different located. Take notice that at this moment, we draw the same diagonal up to the line of the promotion, then put this up to the line for the pawn, and there is only one square that king must go in order to stop the pawn. There are no other other squares that king can get into one move to get into the square of the pawn. And take notice, if the king is into such position that can get only one square onto the diagonal, then if the pawn gets forward, it's going to be pretty much repetitive. Take notice that all of the time the king needs to get into the one and only square to get into the box of the pawn. Again, the same idea, the only square, and then up to the promotion, again a little bit smaller, and then the pawn promotes back in captures because the queen is not protected. Therefore, at this moment, the only square the king catches the pawn is the square that you're highlighting right now, c4. Okay, let's get for the next one. At this moment, we can see the position that the king is a little bit different place. But what about the position? Again, we are drawing the diagonal, we are drawing this line, and you can see that all of these squares that I'm highlighting right now, you can get with the king, and then you are just capture or catch the pawn. But what happens if it is white to move? If it is white to move, white pushes the pawn forward, and now the square of the pawn or pawn box shrinks. Therefore, the king cannot get into any of these squares in one move. Therefore, the pawn runs to the promotion. You cannot catch it. No matter when you go, the king is one step too late to catch the pawn. And as you can see, now the king cannot capture the queen. Therefore, you need to determine if the king is already inside the box or can get into the box in one move. Now, another one. You may ask how to determine what kind of squares or the triangle you should draw. Look about this. The king can get into the left side, into the right side, or into the same file as the pawn. And now, if the king is on the same file as the pawn, there are only 3 squares we need to go. We need to take into advance. One on the left, one on the right, and one the same square as the pawn. And therefore, if the king gets into one of these 3 squares, it catches the pawn. Technically, we could just draw the diagonal into the left, into the right, and after that we can even make these squares right here, and this would be all of the squares inside. But technically, you can probably see already that these 3 squares are responsible for the king to get, and at the same time, the king captures the pawn. Therefore, at this moment, the pawn will no longer get into the promotion line. Of course, if the king gets into these 2 squares, it's okay as well. Therefore, I'll just show you briefly. First, the simplest is to capture. The pawn cannot run to the promotion because there is no pawn. Second, you can get into the left side, and now at this moment, as I just mentioned before, you are inside the box, inside the pawn box. Therefore, if the pawn moves forward, you can get inside the box. Either way, into one of these 3 squares, it doesn't matter which one. Of course, the simplest is to capture, because then the pawn cannot run away. And the same is the idea about the right side. If you get into the right side, you can go either this way or capture the pawn. If you get into the right side, technically this is the triangle, or you can say pawn box at this moment, and you can just capture the pawn or get into this one because this is inside the pawn box as well. Therefore, it's up to you. Therefore, first idea, what happens if the king is neither on the left side, neither on the right side. Now, let's go what's going on if the king is on the left side. Look about this. The king is on the left side from the pawn. Therefore, what then? We draw the diagonal, then we draw these lines, and now, as you can see, if the king gets into one of these 3 squares, the king gets into the square of the promotion. We can call it pawn box, and then catches the pawn. The closer, the better, the less chance to go wrong, especially if you're stressed, if there is a time trouble, and so on. And now, let's go what happens if the pawn is on the right side, or maybe the king is rather on the right side. Therefore, the same rule applies, the only difference is the side. Now this will be the pawn box, this is the triangle as we can see, and we are just drawing this line up to the king, and as you can see, the king can get into these 2 squares to reach the pawn. No matter which square you choose, it's correct. The better is a little bit closer for the pawn, the less chance to go wrong, therefore it's pretty much simple. And now let's go what happens with the practical examples. Of course, take notice we are talking about the pawns that is running to the promotion without the support of any of the pieces, neither the pawns, neither the king. Now, what happens if the pawn is on the second rank? If the pawn is on the starting position, we need to know that there is the exception. Why? Because the pawn can move one the pawn can make a move by 2 squares at one move. Therefore, we are having the same square of the promotion if the pawn would be already 1 square up. Therefore, if the pawn instead of a2 would already sit on the a3 square, then we draw the diagonal, and then we are just having this triangle or pawn box if you wish. And now how the black king should react. If black king wants to catch the pawn, the king needs to get into one of these 2 squares. No matter which square it chooses, if the pawn runs to the promotion by itself without any support, then the king catches the pawn. Let's check it out. When white is going forward, then it's a little bit different, because now, as you can see, the pawn is moving 2 squares forward, and the king cannot get into any of these squares in one move, because the king is too far away. Therefore, even if the king tries hard, the pawn is running to the promotion, and the king cannot capture, because this is 1 square too late. I guess now it's okay, and take notice that this is the exception. If the pawn stands on the initial position in the starting rank, you need to have the square of the pawn or the pawn box drawn up 1 rank. And now again, let's check it out what happens at this moment. Now we have the pawn on the edge of the board, the pawn h4 running to the h8 square without the assistance of the king. And now the only square, as you can see, is the square the king needs to go d4, otherwise the pawn escapes. What happens if white is on the move? If white is on the move, white push the pawn forward, and the king cannot reach the square, the only square into the diagonal, the square e5 to reach the pawn. Therefore, even if the king tries hard, the pawn is faster, and the queen cannot be captured when reaching the promotion square. And now the same position, but black to move. If black to move, as we can see, black can get comfortably into the d4 square that belongs to the square of the pawn box, and then comfortably catches the pawn if the pawn is going to the promotion without the assistance of any of the pieces, and then the king captures the new queen. Another idea that you need to remember and understand is if the king gets into the square in the square of the pawn, the only one, this is the square of the pawn and the pawn box that you need to draw with the diagonal. Why? Because if the pawn is running to the promotion, the only way to catch the pawn is getting into the diagonal. Normally you could have more squares to get into the square of the pawn or the pawn box, but this time there's only one. Therefore, king d4, and now as you can see, the king is inside the pawn box. Therefore, it catches the pawn if the pawn is running to the promotion without the assistant. Again, pawn moves forward. This time we have a little bit smaller pawn box, but again, the king gets into the diagonal. The same idea repeats again and again, and then we are getting into the diagonal, then the smallest of the square, and then the diagonal and capture. Therefore, one more time, if you can see the pawn that is getting into the promotion, and there is only one square you can get, and this square is on the edge of the let's say triangle, in the corner of the triangle, you need to get into this diagonal to catch the pawn. There is no other way. Therefore, it is good to remember. And just 2 examples to see how we can apply this in practice. Now, as you can see, if the pawn is on the starting line, we draw the pawn box if the pawn will be up 1 rank. Therefore, if the pawn a2, it is the same pawn box as the pawn is standing on the a3. And now you can see that the king is already inside the pawn box, already inside, because this is the square that belongs to the pawn box. Therefore, if the pawn moves forward, the king needs to go into the square of the pawn or the pawn box again, either into the square e8 or the square e7. It doesn't matter which one. And then if we just move the pawn forward again, the square of the pawn or the pawn box is the following. We need to get into one of these 2 squares. It doesn't matter which one. And then we are just making the same idea all over again up to the moment we catch the pawn. Catch and capture, of course. Therefore, as you can see, the queen is not protected. Therefore, we capture the new queen. And now let's look about this position. Now we have very similar position, but this time, as you can see, even if the king is inside the pawn box, now it is white to move. And if white to move, white gets into the a4 square, the double move, and then the king needs to get into the diagonal the same as the previous example I just mentioned, the only square that is in the intersection of these lines. Therefore, king gets to the square of the pawn onto the diagonal. Again, the process will be repeated, and then all over again we are getting this way to catch the pawn. And of course, after the pawn gets to the promoting line, the queen is not protected, that's why king captures the new queen. And of course, the draw. And now let's get into the exceptions. Now the exception is the following. If the king cannot get into the square of the pawn for whatever reason, at this moment we are talking about the obstacle of the same pawn as the black pieces, then the king cannot catch and capture the pawn. Why is that? Because the only way to get into the square of the white pawn is get into the e4. And of course e4 is taken by the black pawn, therefore the king cannot get there. Even if the king tries to get the other way, then as you can see the square of the pawn is the following, and again the king cannot get into the square of the pawn. Neither of these squares are available in one move. That's why even if the king tries hard, the pawn is faster running to their promotion and the queen cannot be captured. Therefore, remember about the exception. The second exception, it is the extension of the previous one. When the king is getting into the diagonal and the pawn is not sitting directly, but on the other, let's say, extension of the diagonal. Therefore, the only way to get into the pawn box is this move, but after the other one, we have the similar situation. This time, the pawn box is smaller. And then the king again cannot get into the square to get into the pawn box d5, because this is taken by the black pawn. And even if the king tries hard, it's going to be one square away from the capturing the queen. And the last example, we just had the pawn that was sitting on e4, next on d5, and the last one on c6. Why not on b7? Because if the pawn would be sitting on b7, the pawn cannot get by itself because it's going to be captured on a6. And of course, the pawn on 8 cannot be, let's say, put, because the pawn cannot sit on the first or the last rank without being promoted to the piece. And therefore, that's why the exception. And now again, the only square the king needs to go to get into the square of the pawn is the following. The square e4. Now the king is inside the box, but the pawn moves forward, and again the diagonal square needs to be reached by the king in order to catch the pawn. And now after this one we have the similar situation, the exception that the king cannot longer get into the square of the pawn because the square c6 is taken by the pawn, the black pawn. Therefore, after the chase, the pawn promoted and you cannot catch the pawn. And therefore, as you can see, this is the introduction into the pawn box. And now some kind of conclusions you would like to know that you learned from this video. What are the conclusions? You should know already and understand the following points. The pawn box is used to determine if the king can capture the racing pawn. Another one, you should know how to check out if the king is inside the pawn box or if it can get inside it. The third one, you should remember about the pawn box exception, a pawn box for the pawn's starting position, and remember the pawn box is the same as the pawn that is one rank above. And the last one, if the king cannot get inside the pawn box, then the pawn promotes and it cannot be stopped by the king, and it is especially important if the only square inside the pawn box is on the diagonal line and it's occupied, or you can say blocked, by the opponent's pawns, and it is so-called the obstacle. And now I hope you understand the basics about the pawn box. Why the pawn box is called this way? It is because it is easier to remember. And now you may ask why you should know this pawn box concept, because it speeds up the process of calculation. Therefore, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and let's see into the next one. Thank you very much and see you next time.